What is up, guys? We are live here with Pro Play Games with our top 8 Don Quixote Doflamingo deck profile. We played this at one of our large locals, 25 plus players, and we were able to secure, I believe, 6th place. Only loss was to green, I believe. And yeah, the deck is just really strong. It has this ability to inherently put pressure while proccing his ability. Since his ability does take 2 Dawn, which is a large cost, it does always make him come in for at least 7 when you're trying to trigger his ability, which is actually really good against decks like purple, where you know, you force him to kind of pitch 2 cards to defend leader attack, and then while you're doing that, he's kind of like letting you go wide and bring out like cards for free off the top of your deck. So it does cheat the resource mechanic as far as like paying Dawn to actually play your dudes. You're actually just like kind of paying, like, you know, since you're playing 4 drops for the investment of 3 Dawn, 2 of those Dawn is being used, you know, inherently for pressure on your leader. So if you want to see it as like paying like 2 Dawn or something for your 4 cost cards, that's essentially what this card is doing. It's cheating the resource system, and typically in card games that's pretty strong. So which is part of the reason why we wanted to play him. But yeah, it's a really cool deck. Obviously it requires you to know the top card of your deck at all times, so we play a few cards that kind of help us do that. And on that note, I guess we'll go over some of those like off archetype cards that you play to help you like make sure that you do consistently hit what you need to hit. But these cards are not really like 7 Warlords of the Seas, which is what he plays off the top. So the first card we play is Perona. Now she's, like I said, not a warlord, so you can't play her off the top with your leader, but she is a Thriller Bark Pirate, and you're gonna see that that's relevant because we play a Gecko Moria that gets back 7 warlords or Thriller Barks, so you can actually buy her back from the drop area if you need another stacking of the deck, or you really need to dig for a specific card. The cool thing about her is on play she could look at the top 5 and she can put them all to the bottom in any order, or she can put them all to the top in any order. You cannot split the cards from top to bottom. That is a commonly asked question by some of the newer players in the game, so keep that in mind. But typically this is the card that you want to mulligan for always when you play this deck. If your first hand does not have her, then you typically just want to put it back and try to, you know, give yourself a second spin at trying to see her. But she's super important because not only like early game you set up so that you know what the top card of your deck is for the next 2 turns, and you know what your draws are for the next 2 turns, so that you're always hitting with him and you're always knowing what you're drawing. But it's also very important late game too, when you're trying to dig for your like big drops, because sometimes you do need to see those like 7 drops, those 8 drops, and those 9 drops to finish off the game, because you can't just beat them with 5k attackers. You got to be able to like drop a big 7k or 8k to beat them. So very powerful card. Multiples are good for that reason, and it does have a 1k counter as well too. The next card that we play that we can't really, you know, that doesn't really fit the theme really because it doesn't, you know, trigger off leader, is Desert Spada. This is kind of like a baby version of her. Sometimes it's it's okay if you don't see her just because you're playing Desert Spada, and Desert Spada is just like a smaller version. It just looks at the top 3, rearranges, puts at the top or bottom, so same thing that she does, but it's only 3 instead of 5. It's also a counter, so you would have to use this defensively. So sometimes when you do whiff off her and your opponent's attacking you, you want to keep at least 1 up for this so that you can trigger it and you know, at least be able to know what your next draw, and then make sure that this guy triggers at least once until you bide more time for like a Perona or something like that. So this card can be really good. This card is also a 2k counter. Just 2k counter is just good in the deck. And speaking about 2k counters, you play only 2 Alvida, which is another off archetype 2k counter. The on archetype 2k counter that we play is the Mihawk, which you'll see later, which we can play off the top of the deck and buy back from the yard. So with this we play about 9 2ks, these 5 plus the 4 Mihawk. The only reason why we only play 2 of this is because of space, really. This deck is really tight because you need to make sure that you have like a certain amount of on archetype cards that you can play off of him. You need to make sure that you have your bombs, which are also not playable by him, but you know, your 7 cost, your 8 cost, you know, things like that. And this card is pretty underwhelming to play. Sometimes in certain matchups you will see yourself playing this, like against red. Sometimes I play this just to, you know, help control the board and help them kind of like time walk them, because if you put the cards back into their hand, they're spending their next turn playing the card again. So it's not like an inherent plus, because you're technically going like -1 on this trashing a card. But if you do that enough times, your opponent kind of just is never able to culminate a board, and then you continue pressuring their life. And then we play 3 Love Mellow. This is this is only good at certain points of the game, because this deck sometimes you just have too many cards in hand, because your leader is like playing the cards off the top of your deck, and that's normally what you would be doing in any deck. You'd be playing those cards from your hand, and this is playing within the top of your deck. So you can see that as like drawing a card and playing the card for that investment of Dawn. So because of that, traditionally there are going to be times that you just have too many cards in hand, and this doesn't proc, and you always want this to proc. And because his effect takes 2 Dawn plus the additional Dawn to pay, it's hard to use this effect, play an additional card, and still keep this up. So, but this card is still very good, because there is a lot of times where you're going to see yourself like countering to keep your battle cards alive, and you will get to a low hand size because your opponent is not attacking your life. So because they're not attacking your life, you may not be seeing as many cards as they are, but you're also playing cards from the top of your deck, not really from your hand. So there's times that this procs, and when it does proc, it's very good, because you can see this as like a 2-cost 5k counter, because you're drawing a card, right? And that card is most likely going to be another 1k. And yeah, it's just very good. 4k combo is just great at defending your battle cards if they're attacking with something big. Okay, that's it for all the kind of like off archetype stuff that are not 7 Warlords. Let's get into the 7 Warlords themselves. So these are the cards that you're gonna either play off him or are searchable from the trash off your Gecko Moria, which is a big key player in this deck. So first card we play is the Law 1-drop. This card is a 7 Warlord, so you can play him off the top. Typically you won't be doing that though, because you want to play 4 costs, because that's where you get the value. But it is important to note that he is a legal target. So if you ever want to go blind and you hit this guy, you know, sometimes you do have to go blind, or you have nothing better than to go blind off the top of your deck. You know, that's why it's good to keep your count up. 1 cost blocker is very good. He just doesn't have a counter, which, you know, is fine. You can trim him to 3. There's a lot of times where I don't see needing a blocker early in this deck, because typically what you're doing is you're investing all your Dawn into attacks. But he is nice to like protect your battle cards if they try to like control your board. You can off him, but it's usually not as valuable of a block. You know, you're blocking like a 6k or a 5k, and that doesn't feel great. So because he's able to be recurred, there is it's negotiable to go down on him. This one's not negotiable. This is kind of like your more expensive Perona. For 2 more costs for a total of 3, essentially. He can stack the 5 cards, top 5 cards of your deck. Same thing, you can put them at the top or at the bottom. So sometimes I like doing this where, like, if you see too many of these cards, you can, if you don't really like what you see, you put them all to the bottom, and then you play a Perona and get an additional 5, and then you'll always make sure that you have triggers for this. And it kind of puts those like mediocre 5 cards to the top. It's very common in this deck to just like always want to stick with those 5 and keep them at the top always, so you know what's happening. But if you have multiple triggers, like multiple 5 cost stackers, 5 card stackers essentially, it becomes okay for you to kind of just like put that first look to the bottom if you're not really satisfied with it, or if you only see like 1 good card, or if you need like a certain card in a certain matchup, what you will need sometimes. Then we play Boa Hancock. Oh, he's obviously a 7 Warlord, so you can play him off the top. These are all 7 Warlords. You can play the Boa Hancock. This is probably your #1 card that you want to play off the top of your deck, just because she's well statted. So 5k is as good as it's going to get for the 4 cost cards. So if you're trying to look for power, trying to look for pressure off a card that you play off the top with him, in this deck it's always going to be a 5k. So off rip, her stats are just the best, and she can also add to your either offensive or defensive capabilities. She has the ability to attach a Dawn and draw you a card if you have 5 or less cards in your hand on the attack or on the block. So typically in this deck you will be attacking with it, and typically in this deck you will be triggering it because you do keep a pretty low hand size at times, but in the times that you don't, you can kind of just keep her up as a blocker. Yeah, she's just great. You don't really see yourself playing it for 4 a lot of the times, which is probably an argument to drop this down to 3, but this is the best card that you can hit off your leader pretty much at almost any stage of the game. Next for our 7 Warlords is Marshal D. Teach. Now this one is very good at certain points of the game and certain matchups. Like obviously against purple, you don't want to be bouncing back their who's really, or any of their cards that they can just replay and get an additional on play trigger. But it is pretty vital in like those green matchups when they try to like wall up their kid with blockers, or against red when you want to keep putting them off tempo and bouncing back their Zoros and making them pay 3 every turn to replay them. So there are a lot of matchups that this guy's good. Unfortunately, he does have a 4K stat line, which is pretty low, but being able to just attach 1 Dawn and be able to get in there for damage is very good. He also has a very cool interaction with Leader. If Leader attacks with the 2 Dawn, you pay the 1 and you're looking at the top. Before the blocker step, you're actually able to resolve his effect, play this off the top of your deck in rest mode, bounce back their blocker, and now you go into blocker's phase. So unless they have an additional blocker, not the blocker that you know bounce back, then they can't block this attack. And typically they'll want to always use their blockers on 7K swings because it saves them the 2 cards in hand to defend. So that's really powerful. So that's a cool little interaction that you want to kind of, but sometimes you have to have the foresight. If they don't have the blocker on board, you have to have the foresight off stack 5 to be like, oh, I anticipate a blocker out there. And if you don't, you know, if they don't play the blocker, it's not as cool. But this is a card that I see myself playing a lot of the times just from hand, because now the thing is, when you play him off the top, he's a 4K, is very easy to kill. But if you just play him from your hand, your opponent can't interact with him, and next turn he's like threatening damage with 1 Dawn. Next for our 4 drops is the best one, the Gecko Moria. This guy's just incredible. He has the ability to pretty much buy back any of these 7 Warlords cards that I've been going over, plus the Perona that we saw at the beginning, because she is a Thriller Bark Pirates, and I believe it's the only Thriller Bark Pirates in the entire deck, other than himself as well. But he cannot buy back himself, so he has the ability on play to just recur any of these cards, and that's very good because your leader, you can see that as a +1, you know, and then if you bring out a Gecko Moria, that's technically a +2 because this is buying you back a card. Its stat line is also the highest in the entire deck for the 4-drop slot, so he has the power, you know, comparable to Boa. Next for the 7 Warlords, this is typically going to be your target of your Gecko Moria, simply because this is a 2-cost counter with the 7 Warlords trait. So this is also a card that you don't necessarily always have to keep in hand, or typically in other decks your 2K counters are only 2K counters and that's it. You'll see yourself playing this card typically off the top of your deck a lot of the times, and because of your Doflamingo's effect. It's actually pretty good because of the draw 2, discard 2, is you do the drawing before the discarding, which is ideal. And 2, sometimes when you stack your deck and you hit them off the top and you know the next cards, you know what you're drawing, and it can get you a new cycle of cards, because sometimes you do a top 5 search, right, and then next turn you draw one of those cards, then you go Doflamingo's effect to play the second card. You still know those last 3 cards, and if those last 3 cards are subpar, you can always keep them at the bottom of those 5 cards at the top of your deck, and then he can draw you into them, discard 2, then you only have 1 card that you don't know off the top, then you can play a Perona and kind of see like 4 new cards. You'll still have that like 1 old card at the top, but now Perona kind of gets you deeper. So if you sequence this correctly, this is going to continue to see you additional cards, so that you don't get stuck with those same like 2 or 3 cards that you already know are coming up, and gets you a fresh new look. So it actually gives you a lot more value. This is also very good against like some of the matchups that you need to you know, like red for example, very good. But yeah, sometimes in like more in other matchups you want to keep them in hand for a 2k counter, but you always want to have one in the drop just so that when you do that stack 5 and you get Gecko gets it back. Next is the Kuma, and the Kuma is very good because it's also tied for the highest power in the deck at the 4-drop slot. Obviously it's a 7 Warlords, and it has blocker, so you can actually add this to your army of blockers. So you'll have Kuma, Boa, and the Law. So that's part of the reason why you can drop the Law, because you have so many other blockers as well. And this card on KO plays a Pacifista from your hand, so typically your opponent will respect you having another Pacifista in hand, or having a Pacifista in hand. So you know, this card is great because of that, because it gives you additional value. And the blocker is also very useful. 5k blockers, pretty ideal. And against purple, if you keep this guy out or keep him alive, if they go to board wipe you with Kaido, then you're able to replenish your field advantage with a 6k Pacifista to threaten either lethal or threaten whatever else, but it doesn't completely leave you with nothing else on board. So against purple, you definitely want to prioritize him and having a Pacifista in your hand. Speaking of Pacifista, we're going to get into our beaters of the deck, okay? So these are also off-branded cards or off-thematic cards that don't really fit into Doflamingo playing them off the top, but they're still very necessary in taking down other matchups in the format. And obviously our deck can't just be all 4-cost cards, because then your cards are just weaker than your opponents. You got to have your big bombs, you got to have your game breakers, you got to have your cards that just turn the tide of battle in your way. So this is where we're getting to like the heavier costed powerful cards. So this is at a 6k power for a 4-cost, which is really strong. And this is notably important because it does come out for free off the Kuma, but you're always going to need high power like this, because for one Don he goes 7k at leader, which there's turns where you're going to go like 7k with him, play something out the top, then you're going to go 7k with Pacifista, and like unless they're pitching like 4 cards that turn, they're not really defending that. So you can inflict 2 points damage. And 2, he's also a card that you can like potentially threaten kids with, you know, like you attach 2 Dawn, you attack 8k to 8k on kid, or any other type of like boss creature that they have on board. Against kings, you just attach 1, you're like 7 to 7, show me a 1. You know, it's just a good statted card for its cost. So you can either, I mean, you typically don't want to play it from hand, you just always want to get additional value off the Kuma. So 2 is a fine number. You don't want to overload with these vanillas in your deck, and because you can stack your deck, you can always like find him alongside the Kuma, and it's not as hard of a combo to assemble. Next for the vanillas, we play the 5-cost Virgo. This guy at 7k is just like very powerful, because like I mentioned, 7k is just the sweet spot in this game, but also he gets you much closer to that kid power level, or you know, that king power level, that if you need to do you know, character on character battles, he already starts off very well statted. So he's only a few Dawn from like really being able to take down other battle cards, and he's fairly cheap. When you have 8 Dawn, you can use 3 on your leader and then 5 to play this. It's just important because a lot of your other cards are just much more expensive, like your other bombs. And if you think about it, 5 for 7, that rivals our 7 for 7 here with the Doflamingo 7-drop. So he has the same power level. The reason why we play more of him is because 7 is pretty hard to interact with. In purple, the 5-drop, they can just like Kaido you, 9-drop Kaido you. And purple doesn't really have an answer to Doflamingo, the 7-drop. Like, it's just a like the stat lines are just too powerful. The cost is too high. They have to board wipe. And you know, the 7k power levels, like I said, that's the sweet spot, especially against purple. He also has the ability to return their queen back to their hand, which doesn't seem great off rip, but honestly, if you do that enough times, like if you go Doflamingo, bounce queen, and then they spend their entire turn playing queen, and then you Doflamingo them again, they're 99% of the time losing that game, because now they have to deal with the pressure, and they have to continue to spend like most of their turns playing queens, and they're always going to have some number of comboables in hand. So yeah, it's just an extremely powerful card. And then to round, also 7k stat line, you're able to, you know, threaten the normal boogeymen in the format. And then to round it off, we have triple Dry-Kill Mihawk. And this card is just insane. It's actually overperformed really well. I started with 2 and then found my way at 3. It's just, for 9, this is kind of like Blue's Kaido, really, like 10-drop Kaido, because this is always pretty much inflicting a damage at the 9k range. It's just like they have to have their 2-cost 4k counter and a 1k counter, or they have to have 2k, 2k, 1k. Like, it's just like this guy's always getting in there, and he bottom decks the card. So unlike the rest of the blue archetype, where you're always just putting back the cards in their hand, and like, sure, that's good, like tempo wise, and it like time walks them in a way because they spend their entire turn, you know, doing the same thing. But in this specific deck, yeah, it just becomes insane once you rid the card like entirely. Like, this is purple levels of like removal. Bottom of the deck is essentially KO, probably even better in certain matchups, because now you can't buy that card back. So in the blue mirror match, they can't buy that card back with Gecko or something like that. So yeah, and 7 or less on the cost is really good. So against like Kid, if they play the 7-drop Kid, super punished on this card. And then his stat line is above Kid, so typically the game plan is to rid their blockers and then just try to pressure them with high power level characters. But yeah, that's pretty much it. I think the matchups are pretty good for blue across the board in the current meta. I think the only thing that gives you trouble is probably the green deck if they see like an above average blocker draw. I mean, just defending the Kid is just pretty powerful, I think, against any deck, especially this deck, because of how heavily reliant you are on the 5k swings and, you know, going wide and things like that. So, but yeah, that's pretty much the deck, guys. If you have any questions or concerns, leave them in the comments. And if you liked anything that you saw in this video, make sure you check out our TCG Player Store in the description down below, or the website. Thank you guys again, and until next time.